Hi there, it's Alexandra from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and I'm talking about winter gardening chores that you either don't have to do or you actually shouldn't do. And I'm doing this in coordination with Erin from the Impatient Gardener in the United States. She gardens in Wisconsin. And she's doing a video of the gardening things that you really do have to do in winter and will make a big difference to your garden in the summer. And I'm on that video as well. So why are we doing this video together? Well, Erin and I are at the opposite ends of the temperate gardening zones. To explain the USDA hardiness zones, that is United States Department of Agriculture hardiness zones. The UK, Canada and Australia also have their own hardiness zones, but the USDA ones are the most widely known. There are 13 levels. 0 is the coldest, Arctic I presume, and 12 is the highest. It's pretty tropical, hardly any winter at all. Most of coastal Britain is a USDA hardiness zone of around 9, which means our average winters rarely drop below about -1 degree Celsius, -3 degrees Celsius. Although of course we can have the occasional very harsh winter.
Hi everyone, I'm Erin from the Impatient Gardener, and I'm standing here in my garden in the Midwest of the United States, specifically in Wisconsin, which is right along Lake Michigan in the Great Lakes area. This garden is significantly colder than Alexandra's garden, even though we grow many of the same plants. So here I'm gardening in a USDA Zone 5, which in theory gets to an average cold temperature of -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, that's an average. Last year it was much colder than that. Many years we've never gotten anywhere near that.
Inland in Britain, it can drop to a zone 6 if it's high up, like the Central Highlands of Scotland or some of the mountains in the Lake District. But really interestingly, it can be very different just 10 minutes away from where you live. Here in Faversham, we're about a mile from the sea, which is one of the reasons why we have such mild winters. But if I drive for 10 minutes to Whitstable, which is on the sea, they have frosts even more rarely than we do. And one day I woke up to find it was -1 degree in my garden. So I drove to Doddington Place Gardens, which is about 10 to 15 minutes away. It's inland and it's on a slight hill. And by the time I got there, the temperature was -6 degrees Celsius. So that's a 5-degree difference in just 15 minutes drive. So that gives you an idea why it's really worth getting to know your own garden's conditions. And the advice that you get generally from YouTube channels like mine or from newspapers or magazines may not apply to you if you are a bit colder or a bit warmer than the average. The middle-sized garden roughly equates to a USDA hardiness zone of 9, whereas Erin in Wisconsin's garden equates roughly to a hardiness zone of 5. And yet we have the same plants in our garden. We have roses, we have lavender, we have hydrangeas, we have all sorts of things, lots of shrubs that are the same. So if you visited our gardens in summer, you'd think they were practically in the same climate. In winter, it's very different. So that's really what you need to bear in mind when you're thinking about which gardening chores you should do and which gardening chores you shouldn't do or you don't have to do. Probably the first thing that I don't do is dig. I don't dig my garden at all, and I certainly don't dig over my borders in autumn to loosen them up for the winter. I practice no dig, no till, and there's a video with a link in the description below where I interview Charles Dowding, who's probably the most famous no dig, no till YouTube gardener, and talking to him about no dig in terms of flower gardens. It works just the same as for veg gardens. What I do at this time of year is that I lay a layer of garden compost or well-rotted manure on top of my soil. I don't dig it in, I let it cover the soil. It protects some of the plants. The microorganisms and the worms draw it in for me, so that's great for opening up the soil texture, and it feeds the soil and it covers up annual weed seeds. And it saves an awful lot of time and it saves your back. I started no dig because I had a bad back, and actually I've kept up with it because it's an easy way of gardening. Another job I don't do for the winter is I don't dig up my dahlias. And it's not just about how cold your winters are. If you're in a zone 8 or a zone 9, not digging up your dahlias is certainly worth a try. If you're more like zone 5, 6 or 7, it's much more risky. but more important is your soil and your microclimate. You may have very heavy, very damp soil, and dahlias and cannas do not like spending the winter sitting in very heavy, damp, cold soil. And personally, I don't blame them. I wouldn't like it myself. We're reasonably dry in this part of the UK, although obviously winters are wetter than summers. So I've taken the risk. I leave all my dahlias and my cannas in the borders. I cut off the frosted vegetation. I then cover the plant with a great mound of mulch and I leave it. And I would say that 3/4 to 9/10 of them have come through and they've been fine the following year. And what's more, they've really spread and grown. But it's always going to be a risk, and there's always going to be the one that doesn't come through. But on the other hand, if you think about digging up your dahlias and then having to store them and having the space to store them, maybe this is a risk worth taking. It's up to you to try it. However, it is worth bearing in mind that you shouldn't leave your dahlias in the ground for year after year. I've done a video about this, and there are professional gardeners in the southeast who leave their dahlias in the earth. It's not just about professional gardeners digging them up and amateur gardeners not. However, in professional gardens, nothing stays the same for that long, so it's very unlikely any dahlia would be in the ground more than 2 or 3 years. I left my dahlias in the ground for 8 years, and that was too long. It started to send up lots of very thin stems, and the flowers also deteriorated. So you don't have to dig your dahlias up every winter if you have a mild climate, but you do have to dig them up sometimes. Another thing I don't do is I don't put my pot plants on pot feet. Now, the most valuable plant in my garden is actually in a pot. It's this topiary spiral, and I bought it for £250. It's a massive investment in terms of my garden. So I would do anything to protect it, but I have not put it on pot feet. You will, however, see that it's not sitting in a drip saucer. And I think that this may be the clue. The reason for putting pots onto pot feet in winter is that if your pot sits in cold water and that water freezes, the roots of your plant may get very cold and they may die. That's never happened to me, and I don't put my pots on pot feet. However, they're not in a saucer, so if it rains, the water just generally does drain, and so it's not sitting around in really cold water. When it comes to pots, possibly the best thing you can do for them is to move them closer to the house, because all buildings retain heat. A friend of mine did her horticultural studies in a large college, and there were 2 long beds that stretched out from the building out into the middle of the garden, and the students used to plant them up with tulips. And she said it was fascinating how every year the tulips closest to the house would come out so much earlier than the tulips further down the bed. So it makes a huge difference to bring pot plants right close to the house. I've got a bay tree that has survived some very severe winters because it lives next to the house. There were 2 other bay trees in the middle of the garden and they were killed off in a serious winter. So even in your own garden, you've got microclimates. And one last thing that I don't do is that I don't avoid walking on the lawn. Now, in the lists of garden jobs and garden tasks and garden mornings that you see in the newspapers and magazines, it says don't walk on your lawn. And I've even seen people say put boards on your lawn to avoid walking on them in frost or snow. I have walked across my lawn in frost, I've photographed it, and I've seen that it doesn't do any damage afterwards. But I would say that we don't have very many frosts, so it's not happening very often. And also, there's only really me around to walk on the lawn. If you have a lot of people walking across your lawn, if you have frosts and snow every day, it may be completely different. Over to Erin now to hear what she thinks we shouldn't be doing in our garden, or what we don't have to do in our garden.
Things are much different here than they can be in Alexandra's garden over the winter, because things really shut down here in winter. It's very hard to do much of anything in your garden, and rather unpleasant too, just because it's so cold. But there are a few things you should make sure not to do in your garden in winter if you're gardening in a climate that's similar to mine. So the first thing I would say you need to be careful of not doing in your garden in winter is be wary of those beautiful stretches of weather in which it seems like a great reprieve from winter and you're anxious to get out into your garden and start doing a lot. You can actually do a lot more damage in your garden than you can do good if you get out there too early. You want to be careful of pruning too early. Anything like that can really damage things when you get another cold spell. So it's a good time for enjoying looking at your garden, but maybe not such a good time to get in there and be actively working in your garden. Another thing you want to make sure that you don't do in your garden over winter is fill it up with salt. So of course it gets icy and you need to make sure that walkways are safe to walk on for you and your pets and your friends and neighbors who might be coming over. But you also want to make sure that that salt doesn't end up in your garden beds, where it can do a lot of damage to your soil and to your plants. So a really good option to do when you can is to use sand. That provides a lot of grip. And it's just fine if that goes in your garden at the end of the day. We do use some salt around the garden, but we're careful with where that is, and we use the least that we need to use in order to make sure that it's safe. Usually a combination of salt in the very dangerous areas, stairs, things like that, or places where ice tends to accumulate, and a lot of sand really makes it good. And frankly, your garden will thank you for keeping that salt usage down. One other thing you shouldn't do in your garden is walk around in your garden beds. Again, this kind of goes back to be careful what you do in your garden when you get a warm day, but even if it's not warm, even if everything seems frozen, you don't want to be treading around in your gardens. In addition to possibly accidentally stepping on the crowns of plants, things like that, you can cause a lot of compaction in your garden. So it's best to keep your feet out of the garden as best you can. It's actually a very good rule to follow all year long, but it's especially important in winter when the ground can be sodden with ice and snow and water, frankly. The same goes for your lawn, incidentally. However, I find it much more difficult to stay off the lawn because if you want to be walking around your yard, you're often walking in the lawn. But suffice to say, the less treading you do in your garden on top of anything that is soil, the better.
And do go across to the Impatient Gardener to see what the key winter gardening tasks are that we both think you really do have to do. Because between her garden in Zone 5B and my garden in Zone 9, there'll be some good advice for your temperate garden wherever you are in the Northern Hemisphere or the southern part of the Southern Hemisphere. And if you've enjoyed this, do please hit like, because then I'll know you'd like more practical gardening advice. If you'd like tips, ideas and inspiration for your middle-sized garden, then do subscribe to the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.